All right, so today we're starting Chapter 5. Chapter 4, which we just finished, was on tariffs. Tariffs are the most common form of trade restriction that you see protectionists lobby for. There's a good reason for that. Remember, the two parties that are responsible for there being tariffs are the domestic firms that are seeking protection and the government who grants them that protection through a tariff, through a tax on imports. And so who benefits from that agreement between those two parties? Well, the government gets the tax revenue from the tariff, and the firms, the domestic firms, get the protective effect of the tariff. So the two people at the negotiation table, it's a win-win for them. It's the third party, U.S. consumers, that are not at the table, or the domestic consumers, depending on which country is doing the tariff. The domestic consumers, who are the ones that are left out. They're the ones who pay the tax to the government. They're the ones that pay for the protection granted to the domestic industry. So the one person who's not at the table, or the group of people that's not at the table, are the ones that are harmed by it. And those two that are there at the table are the ones who both benefit from it. So it's no wonder that these things are very common. Also, the fact that it's a tax, a tariff is a tax on imports, the government has an incentive to kind of go there first. There's other ways to restrict trade. In this chapter, Chapter 5, the main topic is about quotas. And quotas is simply a restriction on imports. It says, instead of importing 10,000 bed sheets a week from the rest of the world, we can only import 2,000 or 4,000 bed sheets. It just restricts the quantity. But if the government simply restricts the quantity, then the government is responsible for sitting there at customs and counting all of the bed sheets that come into the country. And if the quota is set at 4,000 sets of bed sheets, once they hit 4,000, what does the government official at customs have to do to that 4,001st set of bed sheets that lands at the port? And they got to send it back. Well, that's just work. So if you're the government official and someone says, hey, can we have some trade protection? We're looking for a tariff or a quota. It doesn't matter to us. Both cases are going to restrict trade. What do you think the government's more likely to say? Yeah, let's do that tariff because we can get a little money for that. At least our guys at customs, instead of restricting and just counting all day and then having to turn stuff away, any amount of stuff can still come in. We're just collecting money every time it does. And we'll do that. So you see, the majority of trade restrictions tend to be tariffs because, again, the two people at the table are the ones who benefit, and without the tax, the government would not be benefiting there. But quotas are considered a little more simple. They're politically maybe more expedient because it's not a tax on consumers. It looks better on paper, and it's simple to do because, after all, you're not actually collecting money and having to secure that money and put that money somewhere, then figure out how to spend that money. All you're doing is just restricting imports, which is fairly simple in terms of an administrative task. So we do see quotas as another non-tariff trade barrier, and as we will see, there is a way for a government to make money at this. They can actually charge a licensing fee or an import fee along with the quota, and that ends up working just like a tariff, basically. So this chapter deals with non-tariff trade barriers, and non-tariff trade barriers, again, just include everything except for a tariff. Some of these are kind of sly or slick ways of restricting trade. Restricting trade does have a lot of vocal opposition. A lot of free trade economists like myself will write nasty letters to the editorial board whenever the president passed the tariff. There are journalists out there who are free trade journalists who buy into the economics, and they will criticize politicians when they do a tariff, or a quota for that matter. And so to avoid some of that criticism, many times politicians can do clever tricks to get the same result, but not face all of the criticism. So these are other non-tariff trade barriers, and they always have some snazzy story associated with them. But all of them have a common theme. Let me give you an example. There can be things like environmental standards. So we might say, hey, we can't buy this from another country because they're destroying the environment when they make it. And everybody goes, hooray, and all the reporters write, well, our president really cares about the environment. He's willing to even restrict trade based on that, so it becomes a better story. So you can use environmental standards as a justification for restricting trade. You can use health and safety standards. You can say, hey, this stuff is dangerous for our consumers. I remember recently there was a scare about toothpaste coming in from China. Do you know what the chemical was in toothpaste that was scaring people? It's formaldehyde. There was trace amounts of formaldehyde found in toothpaste coming in from China. I think it wasn't really a health threat, but it sounds bad, doesn't it? Oh my gosh, my child is, formaldehyde is used to pickle dead frogs for scientific experimentation. Oh, this is horrible. We're subjecting our children to this. We must not bring in toothpaste from China ever again because they're killing our children with this pickle juice. Well, granted, formaldehyde in certain doses can be problematic. Guess who in this country was leading the charge to convince everybody that formaldehyde was killing your children via Chinese toothpaste? It's not a stretch. Domestic toothpaste manufacturers who probably have trace amounts of formaldehyde in their toothpaste also. And so what were they trying to do? They were trying to get everybody scared into restricting trade so they could have carte blanche. They could have the whole market to themselves. Again, restricting trade to not have to face competition. And who pays for that? Who pays for that restriction in that diminished supply of toothpaste? What's going to happen to the price of toothpaste? So what happens to U.S. consumers? They pay for that protection. It's the same story. It turns out the math works the same way. So really your best bet is to do just that, is to scare the bejesuses out of people, get them all worried that this is going to kill them, and then then we'll restrict trade accordingly. I just saw an example this weekend. I can't remember what it was, but it was another example of something that's going to kill us all. It wasn't Brexit, something else. I'll see if I remember it later. So, again, there's clever ways of using arguments and using other policies. We'll see things like dumping or predatory pricing, specifically anti-dumping regulations, and then some other things like domestic content requirements. And some of these things, they're not even intended to fool you. They're just put in place and no one really knows what they are. And we all just kind of stupidly go through the motions of paying for these things and not knowing what we're actually paying for and who's actually benefiting. Domestic content requirements typically are found on things like imported automobiles. And if we require cars made in another country, say South Korea or Germany or Japan, if we require those cars to retrofit the production process and put U.S. parts, domestic content, into those, like the seats or the leather or something like that, guess what happens to the price of those cars? Yeah, it restricts. So something. What about the cars that are made 100% in another country and there's no domestic content, and we have domestic content requirements? They can't come into the country. It's a trade restriction. So they have to go through the motion of making those cars more American, which ultimately increases the cost. If it was already cost effective to use American parts, they would have already been using them. And they've already made the decision, no, these are the parts we need. And so what if it's like a Porsche or a Ferrari or something, and they actually need really high quality German parts, and we don't make those in America, but there's a domestic content requirement? Well, then you got to go through the whole process of getting someone in the United States to ramp up and make something which they're not necessarily good or efficient or effective at making. So you can put it in that car and then bring it into the U.S. And again, the U.S. consumer ends up paying to protect those U.S. jobs. So these things all work out the same. But there's a wide variety of those. So we're going to talk about some of these. But first, we want to go with quotas. The good news is quotas look just like tariffs. I gave you guys in the last chapter a pretty nasty looking graph. Remember what it looked like? Here, I'll show you what it looks like. Blam. Remember this guy? There's your tariff. And it restricted trade from 10,000 down to 6,000. So we have this tariff that raises the price of the import here, and that effectively reduces the amount we import from 10,000 units down to 6,000 units. Because at the higher price, two things happen. At a higher price that the tariff creates on imports, domestic firms now become more competitive. It's like spotting them some points here. They become more competitive. It's artificial, but they're more competitive. Because more U.S. firms can sell bed sheets at $50 than they could when they were competing at $40. And so that requires us to use more U.S. labor and factories to produce bed sheets. So that increases the amount of domestic production. At the same time, that higher price does what to our consumption of bed sheets? It restricts it, reduces it. So we're buying less, we're producing more, and so the amount of imports is effectively restricted by the higher price. Well, I've already told you what a quota is. A quota just restricts the quantity. So what if we instead said, well, let's just restrict the quantity from 10,000 to 6,000 units? That would create a shortage at a $40 price, because at a $40 price, we want to import 10,000 units. And if there's a shortage of something, what's going to happen to the price? It's going to ratchet up. Well, how high will it go up? It'll go up until 6,000 units once again equates supply and demand, and that's at a price of $50. So whether you use a tariff to raise the price $50 and restrict the quantity to 6,000, or you simply use a quota to restrict the quantity to 6,000 and raise the price by $10, guess what you're doing? You're doing the exact same thing. So really, the tariff graph and the quota graph are the same graph, except we don't have a tariff here. We don't have a tariff. We simply have a quota that pushes the price up. So the good news is, I don't have to redraw the graph. It's the same graph, just change the words from the world price under the quota from the world price plus tariff. And it effectively does the same thing. And then here's your quota down here of 6,000 units. So you can write quota. Watch, I'll do it for you. Quota. Boom. World price under the quota. See? Same graph. Does the same thing. So we say for every tariff, there is an equivalent quota that does the exact same thing. There's an equivalency between quotas and tariffs. Who's paying for the higher price bed sheets? Consumers. Who's receiving the protection of the quota? The firms are. It's the same story. Guess what C is? Just like before, it's the redistributive effect, but it's not the redistributive effect of a tariff, it's the redistributive effect of the quota. F and H are still deadweight loss. F is what we call, again, the protective effect of the tariff, and H is the consumption effect of the tariff. And again, that's just from the last chapter. You've already had that. I don't need to rewrite it. It's the same thing. But what was G under a tariff? You guys remember what that was? Stretch. G under the tariff was the government revenue, the tax revenue from the tariff. Remember that? That's why I made it G, so you could remember government. I think the book might use a different letter, but I'd like to make things easier rather than more difficult, if possible. So G, under a tariff, is the tax that the government collects, the government revenue from the tariff. But what did we say about a quota? There is no tax being collected. So the question is, who gets area G? It's not lost, actually. It is lost to the United States. But let's walk through the logic. Think about what we're doing. Under a quota, we're still importing 6,000 units. So literally visualize that. There's 6,000 sets of bed sheets that are coming in to a port city in the U.S. All 6,000 get to enter the U.S. market. Anything after that's turned away. Okay? What do those importers find, or the foreign firms who produce those bed sheets? Originally, they were selling them for $40. But what does the quota do to the price in the U.S.? Moves it up to $50. So now those importers bring their 6,000 bed sheets to the U.S. market. The foreign firms bring those to the U.S. market, and they say they got a $40 price tag on there, and we say, no, we'll give you $50 for it. Okay. So who gets that $10 per bed sheet? Who gets that $60,000? The foreign firms get it. So again, if you're a U.S. politician and you're trying to decide between a quota and a tariff, that $6,000 or $60,000 under a tariff goes to the U.S. government. Under a quota, it goes to the foreign firms. Now, that would actually be problematic in politics if your opposition got wind of that, because what could they say you were doing? You're lining the pockets of those foreign firms, right? That's bad. So Consequently, we do see a lot more tariffs than quotas because there's just some issues with that. But I mentioned earlier, there's something you can do with this. Once again, imagine you're one of those foreign producers of bed sheets and you're coming into the U.S. market. You know that there's a lot of people that want to sell bed sheets in the U.S. market. And you also know that they're going to cut off the imports after 6,000. When do you want to get your bed sheets to the port? Can you lollygag and just kind of mess around and take your time? Now, if you wait too long, what's going to happen? Yeah, someone else is going to get in there before you, and you're going to be turned away. So you want to get there quickly. But what could our government do? We could say, oh, yeah, we're not open yet. Now, you guys line up for us. And people say, okay, well, what's the deal here? Well, the government could say, in order to be one of the lucky importers that gets to bring in these 6,000 bed sheets, you're going to have to give us some money. We're going to charge you $10 per bed sheet set to import those things into this country. Now, if you don't pay, you get to turn right around and go home and waste all your time and effort and energy. If you do pay, you can sell your bed sheets here for $50, pay us $10, and what are you getting for your bed sheets? Well, what were you willing to sell them for in the first place? $40. So they're actually saying, well, yeah, I'd be willing to pay up to $10. Now, they wouldn't want to pay $11. Right, $11, that would be a little bit too greedy on our part. They would say, well, a lot of those guys say, no, we got to sell them for $40, we're losing money. But they would pay up to $10. So if the U.S. licenses, creates some kind of a licensing scheme, a quota fee structure, and says, we're going to charge you $10 per bed sheet, how much money will the U.S. government collect when they sell 60,000 licenses? I'm sorry, 6,000 licenses. I gave it away. They'll make exactly $60,000. In which case, what is a quota exactly like?
Tariff.
It's just like a tariff. It's just we're going around our elbows to get somewhere else, right? Doing a different route. But we get to the same result. So again, we're back to that equivalency between a quota and a tariff, but only if the government sets up a fee structure to extract that $10 back from those foreign firms. Who's still paying $50 for their bed sheets? U.S. consumers are. Who receives the protective effect? Well, that's gone. But who receives the redistributive effect? The domestic producers do. So it doesn't really matter how you do these things. The lesson of this chapter is all these things, the math is the same. It's just how you're going to sell it. It's all marketing. You can argue quotas are easier. You can make all kinds of arguments about it, but ultimately, that's the way they work. A couple of definitions that I breezed over here. When we're talking about quotas, we're talking about import quotas, not export quotas. There are such things as export quotas where we voluntarily restrain exports, and guess what they're called? Voluntary export restraints. A very simple reason for why we might have an export quota is for national security reasons. We probably don't want to export nuclear warheads or F-22 fighter jets to our enemies. That would be a voluntary export restraint. Nothing, that's kind of trivial, so we're not going to get into the math behind that. But that's an export quota. So we're going to talk about import quotas because they're more like protective tariffs. And they can be either global or selective. Global just means they apply to all countries equally. Selective means they're aimed at a particular country. We can't really have full global quotas right now because of NAFTA, but that's another story. There is a special case where a quota is a little bit different than a tariff. So if you notice what I did, I said, first of all, there's these two different things, a tariff and a quota. Hey, but wait, they look the same. Oh, but there is a difference. One has government revenue, the other doesn't. Oh, but wait, that's the same too if you set up a fee structure, a licensing structure for those quotas. So now we're right back to being the same, right? But guess what? But wait, there's more. They're actually different in one important way. It's a little bit cumbersome, and I don't want you to get bogged down in the weeds here, and I'll show it to you, but I'm not overly concerned that you understand this. I just want to point it out to you. What I have here is the same graph with different numbers. I'm not sure what my numbers are doing here. These numbers are wrong. Ignore the numbers. It's the same graph where we're showing this restriction, but now what I'm doing is I'm allowing a demand curve to shift over, because this happens. Demand can change. Demand can increase or decrease. If you have a tariff in place and there's an increase in demand for that product, it's really not that big a deal. And again, there's way too much going on here for your brain to kind of wrap around it. But here's the basic idea. With a tariff, if you have an increase in demand, you're going to want to import more. And a tariff says, go right ahead, import as much as you want. The only condition is for every unit that you import, you have to pay the tariff. What does a quota say? If there's an increase in demand and we want to import more, the quota says, you can't import anymore. So a quota is very restrictive when it comes to an increasing demand scenario. And what that does is it causes the price to shoot up even more. Instead of going up only $10, and again, ignore the numbers here, it might go up by $20. And that actually increases the size of the deadweight loss. All that means is that quotas are a little less efficient than a tariff when you have increasing demand conditions. So again, back to that decision, should we do a tariff or a quota? The only real reason why you might choose one over the other, if you've already set up the fee structure and everything, and they're basically the same, is that if you expect a big increase in demand, you should probably go with a tariff, because it accommodates that increase in demand a little bit better than a quota does. That's what this graph shows you, and I'm not interested in you understanding this graph, but I did want to show it to you and kind of give you a feel for it. You can see where what I'm showing you here is under a tariff, the deadweight loss just shifts over, but under a quota, it gets bigger. That's what this graph is basically showing you, is the difference between the two. So that's the primary difference, and that's just something I wanted to point out for clarity's sake, or to be complete. Actually, it's not any more clear probably, but it is more complete. So that's your quota versus a tariff. And as long as you know that little caveat that under increasing demand conditions, a tariff works a little bit better than a quota. That's all I want you. I wouldn't make you draw that on a test, because I would just get a lot of crazy looking answers. It's not teaching. Okay, voluntary export restraints I said are an export quota. And I gave you an obvious example that we don't want to release our top-end fighter jets to our enemies. That would be a silly thing to export. Even if, Northrop Grumman makes a really cool jet, that doesn't mean we should be exporting it to our enemies. So we might have a policy put forth by the government that says, we're going to not export this to the rest of the world, and that would be a voluntary export restraint. There's other reasons to do voluntary export restraints, but it has to do with that argument, that first argument about the difference between a tariff and a quota. I want you to think for a second about, what if you were the government official? Let's say you were the Japanese government, and you heard that the U.S. government was about to slap a huge tariff against the importation of Japanese cars into the U.S. market. Now, you know this is going to hurt you because you've been exporting a lot of cars to the U.S. market, and this tariff is going to greatly reduce that flow of cars that you like to export to the U.S. market. The writing is on the wall. You, as the Japanese government, are convinced this is going to happen. You see it. You've already talked to all your experts, your consultants. Everybody says, yeah, they got the votes. This is going to happen. There's no opposition to this. Detroit has been reeling, and they're big on this bandwagon. We're about to have huge tariffs placed against us. Well, as the Japanese government, you might get on the phone with the U.S. president and say something like this: hey, we know you're about to slap us with huge tariffs. We know we can't do anything to stop that, but hear us out here. How about instead of you putting a big old tariff on us, which is going to greatly reduce the number of cars that we ship to you guys, how about we voluntarily just reduce the number of cars, solve the problem for you? Now chew on that for a second. Why would the Japanese government, the Japanese country, have an incentive to self-impose a quota as opposed to us impose a tariff on them. What is that area G going to do? Under the tariff, area G is going to whom? The U.S. government. Under a self-imposed quota, where is G going to go? To the Japanese car companies. So do you see how it's the second best solution? The first best solution is that there's nothing. There's no tariff, no quota. But if they have to do one, the Japanese firms would rather it be a quota than a tariff, because then they get to at least sell their cars for a little bit higher price in the U.S. market. So that's one reason for a voluntary export restraint. And many times the justification for that, what the politicians will say, is that they're trying to restore orderly market conditions. The problem is prices moving around is not disorderly in a market. Prices moving around, volatility in a market reflects the underlying scarcity. You're supposed to have prices moving around. So just because prices are low in the U.S. market doesn't mean that the markets are disordered. It just means there's plenty of cars. Is it more orderly to restrict the cars and have those prices shoot up? That's their argument, and I'm not sure exactly where they're going, except for the fact that they're arguing that it'll help mediate volatility, but that's kind of a bad argument. All right, that's all for domestic or for voluntary export restraints. I mentioned domestic content requirements already. It's just simply a policy that says any car imported into the U.S. must have, say, 15 or 25% U.S. domestic content. And if you increase that domestic content requirement, what's going to happen to the number of imports? Yeah, it's going to decrease. So it's just a trade barrier. It's a way of restricting trade. And then who benefits from having more domestic content in cars? Well, it's U.S. firms. But who's paying for it? Consumers. Same idea, just a different variation of the same theme. Subsidies, a couple of parts. I'm going to zip through these pretty quickly because I want to, after we finish this, I want to take a break. And when we get down to standards, that's going to be another lecture. So I'm going to finish off a couple of these things here first. There's two broad categories of subsidies, domestic and export subsidies. A domestic subsidy is a situation where a U.S. firm is not competing with cheap imports very well. The government can subsidize that industry and allow it to be more competitive. So let's say you're producing bed sheets in this country. You're accustomed to selling them at $60, but foreign bed sheets are earning the market at $40. Well, the government can simply just give you $10 or $20 for every bed sheet that you produced. And in that case, you would be competitive at the 40, because you could still sell them for 40 now and be competitive, and then you're getting a kickback from the government, a subsidy for every one you sell of 10 or 20 bucks, and that puts you right back up to where you were in the first place. Where does the government get money to give to bed sheet companies? From taxpayers. It's just out of the general revenue in this case, right? There's no tariff in this case, but there's tax revenue. So money is coming out of U.S. pockets and given to protect domestic jobs to the bedsheet industry. And so we end up in the same position we were with the tariff. It's the same idea. Direct subsidies have a bad name. That kind of a subsidy where the government takes taxpayer dollars and gives it to corporations has been labeled something which is kind of an interesting term called corporate welfare, because that's exactly what it is. And who's the last person that you think we want to be giving welfare to? The last person, the last entity. You know, rich corporations, right? Why are they receiving kickbacks? They should just be more competitive. That gets a lot of kickback when we find out that these things are happening. Subsidies don't have to be direct subsidies, monetary payments to firms like that. Subsidies could be favorable tax treatment. Subsidies could be building roads that benefit a particular firm. Subsidies could be building a power plant near an industrial park, which allows their energy costs to be cheaper. And they can argue, well, the power plant was built for the community, not for a subsidy. So there's ways of hiding the subsidies. Building a bridge could be a subsidy. It could reduce the transportation costs of a particular firm. Subsidies, they're tough. You know, like whenever a sports team, an NFL football owner wants the taxpayers to build their stadium for them, it's a tough sell to say that taxpayers should be building stadiums for billionaires, right? And again, that's a subsidy. Now, that's not to reduce imports, but that's an example of how these are somewhat politically problematic, although they're still done. Export subsidies, let's say that you're exporting your particular products, but you're not competitive on global markets. Well, the government can subsidize that export behavior. But subsidizing exports is particularly bad for taxpayers because what's happening? Taxpayers are having money taken out of their pockets to give to firms so we can sell cars or whatever cheaper to the rest of the world. It's just money flowing out of the country, right out of taxpayers' pockets into foreign consumers' pockets. Again, what's the argument? If we subsidize this industry, we'll protect those jobs. And who's paying for it? U.S. taxpayers. We're all the same. Anti-dumping regulations refer to a practice that many firms in other countries are accused of and sometimes attempt. However, the practice of product dumping tends to not be very successful, and it's hard to actually identify when it's truly something that's bad that we should regulate against and when it's simply a normal business practice. So that we have to kind of backtrack and talk about product dumping, which is also referred to as predatory pricing. But there's other reasons why you dump products besides predatory dumping, which is the equivalent of predatory pricing. And so let's talk about what that is, what those things are. First, sporadic dumping. Every now and then, firms dump product on the market, and what they're not doing is trying to drive their competition out of business. That's what we call predatory dumping or predatory pricing. The idea with predatory dumping / predatory pricing is if you're a market leader, if you have substantial market share, and you either dump a lot of product to lower the price or you set a really low price below fair market value for the things you're selling, what's that going to do to your competition? It's going to drive them out. Once all your competition is out of business, what are you? Monopoly. And then what do monopolies do with prices? They increase the price. So do you see the strategy there? Hey, let's do something a little unsavory here. Let's actually take a loss. Let's be anti-competitive. Now, to be competitive is one thing, right? Everybody wants to make a profit, but at the same time, to be competitive means you have to cut into those profits. You got to lower your prices. You got to get things down as low as possible. What you're not doing when you're competitive is selling at a loss in order to make profits because you're losing money. So that's considered anti-competitive. The only reason you would actually do that would be to drive your competitors out of business so you could then come back and raise prices and abuse the consumers. So we have regulations against that. It's against the law to predatory price or to predatory dump. But a behavior that mimics that is something very common. I was at Kroger this weekend, and I noticed that the milk was on sale for $1.99. Now, normally the milk is like $3.59. And I imagine their margins are not too big on a gallon of milk. There's not a huge markup that you can do on milk, probably. And so at $1.99, I bet they were losing money. Well, was Kroger predatory pricing and trying to drive Walmart out of business by selling their milk for $1.99? Why did they have their milk on sale?
So keep back, come in and get something else.
And what's the problem with milk and keeping it on the shelves for too long? There's an expiration date on there, isn't there? And it's not too far in the future. So if for whatever reason it was particularly hot and no one wants to drink milk when it's hot, they had too much milk on the shelves and they had to get rid of it, they just put it on sale. Now, they're not predatory pricing. They're not trying to become a milk monopoly in Middle Georgia. they simply had an expiration date. They had to get rid of that stuff because the second it went past that expiration or even got close to that expiration date, how much is that milk worth? Zero. So they'd rather get $1.99 out of it today than zero tomorrow. So they dump it on the market. But that's sporadic dumping. And putting stuff on sale, you can get a great deal on heavy wool jackets right now because it's 105 dang degrees out there. So the fact that wool jackets are on sale is not an example of predatory dumping, which I just explained to you. There's also one other form of pricing phenomenon that may look like predatory pricing because it's not sporadic, like putting milk on sale. It's actually persistent, so we call it persistent dumping. And this is actually, in pricing terms, referred to as price discrimination. What's a good movie that's out right now? I know a bad movie that's out right now. Independence Day, Resurgence. Is that the name of it? Anybody see that this weekend? Some of you did, because it was the #1 movie this weekend. Someone saw that movie. It's got a 33% on Rotten Tomatoes. So it's a blockbuster movie. Had a lot of people paying for it, but apparently it's not that high quality movie. Anyway, if you went to the movies this weekend on Sunday at noon to see this film, you probably paid something like $6 or $7. However, if you waited until 9 o'clock on a Saturday night, how much is it going to cost you to go see that movie? Yeah, 10 or 15. If you go to IMAX 3D, it's going to cost you probably $15, right? It might be 18. But you can see the same movie earlier for $6. Well, that's an example of price discrimination. Now think about what's going on here. Wow, they're selling that movie really cheap, those tickets really cheap at noon, but the real price that we see every night is more like $10, $15. So are they predatory pricing? Are they trying to drive their competition out of business until about 5 in the evening every day, and then every day at about 5 o'clock in the evening say, hey, let's stop doing this. This is silly. And then just go back to regular pricing, and then do the same thing the next day. Now, why do they have two different prices? Well, because no one wants to go to the movies at noon. It's the matinee for a reason. Most people want to go to movies in the evening with their date after dinner, that kind of thing. And so there's a higher demand for movie tickets in the evening. So you have a segmented market. Whenever you have a segmented market, either over time or over space, then you can sell things at different prices. So for instance, a movie in Macon might be $10. A movie at the same time in Manhattan might be $25. Does that mean they're predatory pricing here? No, it's segmented markets. As long as you can prevent resale, you can have price discrimination. And price discrimination, even though it sounds bad, is actually a good market phenomenon. It's something that we like to see in the markets because if the prices were always $10, some people couldn't afford to go to the movies. So if you can't afford the $10, what can you do? Well, you can go to the matinee and still see the movie. Granted, you can't go when everybody else wants to go, but that's because of scarcity, and that's the way the markets work. But the good thing is that we all like that choice. It's a choice that you have. Same thing if you want to buy the new Harry Potter novel that comes out, right? If you buy it immediately, you're going to pay $25 for the hardback. But what will happen 6 months later? The paperback comes out for $8. So if you wait, you can get the cheaper version. So and again, that's some people have a high demand and want to pay that money up front for it. Fine, they get an early release of it. Other people can wait and they'll later release. Or you can go to the library and check it out for free. But no one goes to libraries anymore. Can you steal books online now? I bet you can. I bet just like you can steal music online, you can steal. Don't steal online. Well, don't steal offline either. Don't steal. You should pay for all of your books, especially your textbooks. Pay a lot for those. So if you can prove that a company is predatory dumping, and they're in another country and they're dumping in the U.S. market to drive U.S. businesses out of existence, and then they're going to later raise prices and hurt the U.S. markets, then you can apply for anti-dumping regulations to restrict those imports. The problem is, what have we seen about our models for importing things from other countries? Typically, the reason we import them is because they're cheaper. So right off the top, everything looks like predatory dumping that's imported into this country. So anybody can make the argument that well, they're predatory dumping, when in fact, they may just have the comparative advantage. They may just have a cost advantage. So they're not selling below fair market value in the first place. So firms will try to get anti-dumping regulations passed against imported. An example of that would be when the first flat screen monitors for laptops came out. They were being made in the US, but they were very expensive. I think it was Toshiba or another Japanese company that figured out a way to make them a lot cheaper and started selling them in the US market. And what did that do to the price of laptops? It made it much more reasonable and affordable, and the whole market eventually grew, whereas we didn't used to have laptops. Now I'm not sure I bet more laptops sell now than desktop computers. I wonder what the numbers are on that. But it used to be the other way around because they were so expensive. Well, the US monitor making companies were arguing that Toshiba was product dumping in the US. And again, I'm not sure if the quote on that was Toshiba or another company, but they applied for anti-dumping regulations to restrict that flow. Because what do they want to continue doing? Selling expensive monitors to U.S. consumers. So who's paying for that protection? U.S. consumers are. So again, works out the same. Okay, don't worry about the OEDC labor standards. I should drop that from the list. Before I do standards, what I want to do is jump forward and do government procurement policies, and then we'll take a break, and in the next lecture segment we'll handle standards, because that's a decent-sized lecture in and of itself, and it's very interesting, actually. Government procurement policies. If you're the President of the United States and you need a bulletproof, bomb-proof limousine to drive around to meetings in Washington, D.C. in, you had better buy a U.S.-made car. You better buy a Cadillac limousine or a Lincoln Continental or something like that, Lincoln Town Car limousine, something like that. Why would it be a bad political move to go out and buy a Mercedes, BMW, Toyota, or Lexus limousine? What are your voters in Detroit not going to do for you next election? They're not going to vote for you. So you have a political incentive to buy U.S.-made things. We call this government procurement policies. When the government buys or procures something, they always seem to want to buy American first, and it's typically for political reasons. There's some interesting examples of government procurement policies, and I've had students over at Warner Robins who are in contracting, and they do have to go through a list of certified vendors who are U.S. first. And if they can't find the U.S. vendor, then they can buy an import. So let's take the example of a stapler. If you need to buy a stapler, where are you going to go? You need a stapler for your general household use or for school. Where would be a good store to go to buy a stapler? Maybe Staples or Walmart. You can probably buy one. I bet they have them at Target, Office Depot, Office Max, any of these stores, right? I wonder if you can buy a stapler at Lowe's or Home Depot. Anyway. Yeah, let's just go to Staples and let's think about staplers. I should probably do this online, but you can do this at your own convenience. Just research staplers real fast. And I bet you're going to end up paying somewhere between $5.99 and $10.99 for a stapler of decent quality. If you want to, you can pay $50 or $60 for an electric stapler that does it automatically for you. I mean, you can spend as much as you want, but you can probably find something, even if you have a home office or you have a small business, you can probably go to Staples and buy a stapler for under $20, which is going to be pretty good quality. And you're going to look on that stapler, and you're probably going to see that stapler is made in China. Now, when you buy that for your home use or your business use, typically you don't check to see if it's made in this country or not, because you don't have that political motivation. You're not worried about who's going to vote for you. You're just buying a stapler at a reasonable price to use, and if it breaks, you can just go buy another one because they're so dang cheap. But if you're with contracting at Warner Robins Air Force Base, Robins Air Force Base, you have to go through a certified vendors list, and those vendors have already gone through the trouble of making sure that these staplers were made in this country, which, by the way, what does that do to the price of those staplers? It's probably going to be about a $50 stapler instead of a $10 stapler. Not only that, these certified vendors have fought really hard to get on that vendors list. And that means that only a few of them made it onto that list, which means there's not a lot of competition. So even though they're paying $50 for the stapler, guess what price they have listed in their contract, in their catalog, that the government official is going to be spending taxpayer dollars on. They can probably list it at $120, and it doesn't matter because unlike you buying the stapler for your personal use, if you are a government employee buying it for the government use, you're not spending your money. And so you don't get to keep the change. So it doesn't really matter. Also, you've probably waited till the end of the year where you have a budget and you got to spend that money that you've been allocated. And so it's kind of good that that stapler costs $120 because you've got $500 in your office supply budget, and if you don't spend that this year, what happens next year? They're going to take it away from you. So you have an incentive to buy 3 of those staplers so you can spend as much of that money as possible. So you go through the process and you fill out your forms in triplicate and you send that up and you get about 6 signatures of people to approve the purchase of these 3 staplers through this Government Procurement Policy Procedures Manual. You've guaranteed that you bought a U.S. stapler, you bought it through one of your certified vendors, and by the time you factor in all the man hours at the G10 level, G12, and G14 level that had to sign this stuff, the 5 or 6 man hours it took to buy the dang stapler, the stapler ends up costing about $10,000. Who's paying for that stapler to be bought in this country? Yeah. And again, it's for more or less for political reasons. There's another motivation. It's not just voting, because no one is going to not vote for somebody because they bought a damn stapler for $10. But the worry is that if you just let the government official do it like you and me do it, they might go to their friend's store and buy a stapler from them, and that's corruption. So instead of letting that person get a $10 sale, they're going to let another person get a $10,000 sale. I'm not sure exactly how this helps taxpayers, but it does avoid favoritism, which could be a problem if that was running rampant.